Lady Eugenie Montrose had never imagined her life would be defined by such desperate circumstances. It wasn't just the mounting debts from her late father's mismanagement, it was the insidious burden of every inch of her family's crumbling legacy pressing against her. She had been raised with the finest gowns, exquisite manners, and a promise that she could choose her destiny. But now, at 23, she knew better, and her family was teetering on the brink of ruin, and her only hope of survival lay in a respectable marriage, a good match, a wealthy suitor. However, there was no room in her life for dreams, only practicalities. The ball at Lady Hathaway's estate was the pinnacle of London's social season. Elegant couples glided through the glittering ballroom, their laughter and conversation flowing as easily as the champagne. But for Eugenie, the night was suffocating, each dance a reminder of her own vulnerability. She had been standing in the corner, pretending to admire a painting, when the chaos of the room suddenly melted away, leaving only the quiet hum of her own thoughts, and she needed air. The library, she thought, would be a perfect refuge. The doors opened with the faintest of creaks, and the cool, musty scent of old books filled her lungs, and she stepped inside, grateful for the peace it offered. The room, lined with tall shelves, was nearly empty. There, standing before a shelf filled with leather-bound volumes of Greek philosophy, was a man. She didn't know him at first. His back was to her, his dark brown hair tousled in a way that suggested he hadn't taken the time to care. His posture was relaxed, but his presence, commanding, unyielding, struck her immediately. Eugenie froze for a moment, half hidden behind a towering shelf. She could have turned back and left without him noticing, but something about the way he stood there, lost in thought, held her attention. She cleared her throat, unsure if she wanted to disturb his peace. But then he turned, his eyes meeting hers with such intensity that it felt like the air in the room thickened. "Ah, Lady Eugenie," he said, his voice deep, almost amused. "I didn't expect to see you hiding among the books." She felt her pulse quicken. How did he know her name? She hadn't given him any indication of recognition. "I wasn't hiding," she replied, her tone sharper than she intended. "I came here to escape the suffocating air of the ballroom." He raised an eyebrow, an amused smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Escape, you say? Or perhaps you seek a moment of quiet? A place where no one will expect anything of you." Her heart skipped a beat. This man was as perceptive as he was bold. She stiffened, unwilling to reveal more than she should. "I suppose that's one way to put it," she answered, her voice cool. He chuckled softly, stepping closer, then glanced at the books on the shelf before turning his full attention back to her. "I imagine you are well versed in philosophy, Lady Eugenie. What is your take on Aristotle's view of virtue?" Eugenie blinked, caught off guard. The sudden shift from casual conversation to a deep philosophical inquiry threw her off balance, yet, in a way, she found it intriguing. Few people her age would dare engage her in such a discussion. But this man seemed to expect it of her, as though they were already familiar with one another. Aristotle believed that virtue was a mean between extremes, she began, feeling her confidence return. A balance, if you will, where one must avoid both excess and deficiency. "Very good," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "But do you believe that's true? Can virtue truly be achieved by avoiding extremes, or does it require something more?" Eugenie's mind raced, grappling with the unexpected challenge. His eyes held a glint of curiosity, as though he were truly interested in her opinion. It was a refreshing change from the usual empty pleasantries she endured. "I think—" She hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I think that sometimes the extremes are unavoidable. And perhaps, at times, we must embrace them to understand who we truly are." The silence between them stretched for a moment as he considered her words. Then, with a sly smile, he nodded, as though he had just discovered something he hadn't expected. "You are not what I expected, Lady Eugenie," he said, his voice soft but laden with meaning. "I find myself intrigued." The spark of something unexpected flickered in her chest. She hadn't expected to find someone like him in this room, someone who challenged her so effortlessly, who saw beyond the outward facade she had perfected over the years. She swallowed, feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and curiosity. Before she could speak again, a sudden, sharp voice broke the moment. "Lady Eugenie! There you are!" She turned, startled, to see her aunt standing at the door, eyes wide with surprise. "We've been looking everywhere for you." The man's gaze flickered over to the doorway, then back to her, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose that's my cue to leave," he said quietly. "But perhaps we'll meet again, Lady Eugenie. In a less crowded setting." Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing through the door as swiftly as he had entered. Eugenie stood there for a moment, still caught in the echo of his words. Something inside her stirred, something she hadn't felt in a long time. As she followed her aunt back to the ballroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The man in the library had ignited a spark within her, one that she couldn't easily dismiss. There was something about him, something she couldn't place, that made her want to see him again. But she knew better than to entertain such thoughts. A marriage, she reminded herself, was her only true escape. Still, she couldn't help but wonder, had he, too, felt that strange, undeniable pull between them? Her thoughts were interrupted as they re-entered the crowded ballroom, and the weight of her responsibilities returned with full force. But she couldn't ignore the fact that, for the first time in months, her mind wasn't on her family's debts or her dwindling prospects, it was on him. The mysterious man in the library. Over the next 2 weeks, Lady Eugenie couldn't shake the memory of that brief but electrifying encounter in the library. The Duke of Callum, though she had learned his name only after he disappeared from her sight that night, had been a mystery wrapped in arrogance and intellect. She had thought little of him in the days that followed, chalking up their brief conversation to a mere quirk of fate. But the more she tried to forget, the more his words, his smile, his presence lingered in her thoughts. Then, as if by sheer coincidence, he appeared again. It started with a seemingly chance encounter at the British Museum, where he approached her while she was admiring a statue of Athena. He had leaned close, his voice warm but amused as he asked, "Have you found the perfect balance between the goddess's wisdom and her warlike nature, Lady Eugenie?" The question felt like a continuation of their previous conversation, and her heart skipped a beat as she caught the glint of something mischievous in his eyes. His knowledge of her interests, the way he always seemed to know when and where she would be, unnerved her. Yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about him that tugged at her, making it impossible to avoid these coincidences. The next meeting occurred in Hyde Park, where he appeared just as she was taking a solitary walk along the path lined with ancient oaks. She tried to act unaffected as he approached, but he knew her too well by now. "I believe this park has witnessed many moments of reflection, Lady Eugenie," he had said, as though they were old friends sharing an intimate joke. "It seems fitting to encounter you here." She bristled at the implication of familiarity, but his easy charm made it hard to resist engaging with him. Her resistance, which had been so firm at first, began to fray, though she refused to acknowledge it. At least not to herself. Soon after, their next meeting was at a local bookshop, a quaint little establishment tucked away on a side street. He had appeared out of nowhere again, his presence so sudden and so natural that it almost felt as though he had been waiting for her. "I imagine the latest edition of Plato is not quite what you're seeking," he said, his voice low as he joined her at the shelf. "Perhaps you'd prefer something more obscure? Something with more fire." She glanced up, meeting his eyes for a brief moment before turning away. The unnerving sense that he was somehow always watching her grew stronger. Eugenie knew she couldn't keep indulging in these chance encounters. Her duty was clear. She was supposed to secure a future for her family, not waste time with an aristocrat whose presence left her both thrilled and unsettled. It wasn't until she was alone in her study, staring at a letter from Lord Pemberton, who had recently expressed interest in courting her, that the weight of her situation truly hit her. Lord Pemberton was an excellent match, kind, wealthy, and thoroughly respectable. Her family would approve of him. But Eugenie could not ignore the growing pull of Callum, the Duke of Callum, whose presence had begun to haunt her dreams. He had started to invade her thoughts with such intensity that it became difficult to ignore. What did he want from her? She had no delusions that a man like him would seek her out without reason. The thought of his sudden reappearance at Lady Hathaway's ball weeks ago filled her with a strange mix of curiosity and dread. And yet, the truth was undeniable. Despite her initial resistance, Eugenie found herself drawn to him, to the challenge he posed. One afternoon, as rain began to fall in sheets, Eugenie found herself unexpectedly in a carriage with him. She had taken a ride to the outskirts of London for a meeting with a potential suitor's family, but the storm had forced her to take refuge in a nearby shelter. As luck would have it, or perhaps, as he had engineered it, Callum had been there. "I imagine this storm will keep us trapped here for a while," he remarked, his voice deep and steady as the rain pounded against the carriage windows. "It seems fitting that we should share this moment together." His proximity was overwhelming. She could almost feel the heat from his body radiating toward hers. They sat in silence for a few moments, the soft creaking of the carriage filling the air between them, before he turned to her with a glint in his eyes. "Lady Eugenie," he said softly, "are you truly so determined to resist what is plainly in front of you?" The question, so direct, caught her off guard. She hadn't expected him to speak so boldly, nor to make her feel as though she were trapped not only by the storm but by her own feelings. She glanced away, staring out the window to avoid his penetrating gaze. "I am not sure what you mean," she replied, her voice cold but betraying a slight tremor. "I'm certain you are aware of the stakes, my lady," he continued, his tone never faltering. "And yet, you continue to distance yourself from the truth. You're torn between duty and desire, aren't you?" His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wanted to deny it, to assert her control over her own life, but she couldn't. His understanding of her internal struggle unsettled her more than anything. "You're wrong," she said, her voice quieter now, but firm. "I'm simply trying to do what's right." He chuckled softly, leaning in closer. "Is that so? Or are you simply afraid of what might happen if you stop resisting?" His breath brushed against her ear, and for a fleeting moment, she considered what it might mean to let go, to allow herself to fall into the temptation he represented. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. The carriage lurched to a stop as the rain finally subsided, and Callum's voice broke through the tension. "Until next time, Lady Eugenie," he said, as though their encounter had been nothing more than a casual meeting. But the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. This was no accident. He was pursuing her. And she was starting to let him. The garden party at Lady Ashton's estate was an annual affair, where the cream of society came to flaunt their wealth and their connections. Eugenie stood at the edge of the sprawling lawn, her mind preoccupied with the many suitors who had shown interest in her over the past few weeks. Despite Callum's increasingly calculated appearances, she had done her best to remain focused on her duty to her family. Lord Pemberton, whose proposal had come at the height of her confusion, had been a reliable suitor, steadfast, kind, and respectable. But the more she thought of him, the more the memory of Callum lingered in the back of her mind, a quiet storm she couldn't silence. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the scene, but Eugenie couldn't shake the tension coiling in her chest. She had already turned down several offers of dance when she felt a presence at her back. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Callum's distinct cologne, a mixture of cedar and something unmistakably sharp, reached her before his voice did. "Lady Eugenie," he said softly, as though they were alone in the world. "I've been looking for you." Eugenie stiffened, her eyes narrowing slightly. She was tired of his persistent, seemingly random appearances. At first, she had convinced herself that it was mere coincidence, but now she knew better. He was no longer pretending to be a chance acquaintance. He was after something, and it unsettled her. "Your Highness," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "I didn't realize you had such an interest in finding me." He stepped closer, too close, and she could feel the warmth radiating off his body. "I suppose the ball has become tedious for you as well," he said, his gaze locked onto hers with that same intense focus. "Perhaps we could take a walk." Eugenie hesitated, her thoughts battling each other. She had always prided herself on her ability to keep control, but every time she encountered him, she found it slipping away. Before she could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Eugenie turned to see Lord Pemberton approaching, his face lighting up as he smiled at her. Callum, with his characteristic coolness, glanced over at him, offering a curt nod before stepping back. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but Eugenie saw it clearly. The subtle dismissal, the calculation in his eyes. He was watching Pemberton. "Lady Eugenie," Lord Pemberton said warmly, offering his hand. "Shall we take that dance you promised me earlier?" Her heart sank. She had been avoiding him lately, her thoughts too consumed by Callum's manipulations, but she couldn't avoid him any longer. "Of course, Lord Pemberton," she replied, forcing a smile onto her lips. She took his arm, but before she could move away, Callum's voice interrupted once again. "You've made an admirable choice, Lady Eugenie," Callum said, his tone almost mocking, though his words were polite. "Lord Pemberton is a fine gentleman, indeed." Eugenie's breath caught in her throat. She had been careful not to allow any sign of weakness in front of him, but his words, so deliberately chosen, pierced her defenses. It was as though he were playing a game, and she was the pawn. As she danced with Lord Pemberton, she couldn't stop thinking about the insinuation in Callum's voice. His presence in her life was becoming more than just an inconvenience, it was starting to feel like a trap. The tension between her desire to be free of him and the undeniable pull she felt toward him was becoming unbearable. After the dance, as she excused herself from Lord Pemberton, Eugenie found herself in the garden, seeking a moment of quiet. She wandered aimlessly, trying to regain her composure when, out of nowhere, she found herself face to face with Callum. "You've been avoiding me, Lady Eugenie," he said softly, his voice low and full of meaning. Eugenie's heart raced as she took a step back. "I have not," she lied, her voice steady but her mind a whirlwind. "I've simply been busy." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a knowing edge. "You're lying, of course," he said, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him. "You're afraid. Afraid that I'm right, that you'll never truly be free." His words struck her hard, like a slap, and she froze, unable to respond. Callum stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've given you time, Eugenie. Time to make your choice. But make no mistake," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, "if I can't have you, I'll make sure no one else does." His words hung in the air, charged with an unspoken threat, a possessiveness that made Eugenie's stomach turn. She had never felt more trapped in her life. Before she could respond, Callum turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the garden with her racing thoughts. That night, as she lay in her bed, she could hear the distant sounds of the party continuing on below, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Callum was no longer simply a distraction or a source of irritation. He was a shadow over her future, and she wasn't sure how to escape him. The next day, as if to prove his words, she learned that Lord Pemberton had mysteriously withdrawn his proposal. The reason given was vague: family matters, business concerns, but Eugenie didn't believe it. She knew in her gut that Callum's reach extended farther than she had realized. She had become a pawn in his game, and he was slowly taking control. The realization hit her with the force of a thunderclap: Callum was no longer playing by the rules. He was shaping her future, and she was powerless to stop him. A month had passed since Lord Pemberton's unexpected withdrawal, and in that time, Eugenie's life had taken a turn she couldn't have anticipated. It wasn't just that her suitors seemed to vanish one by one, it was the way they disappeared, like shadows swallowed by the dark. There had been no explanations, no farewell letters, just silence. And with each disappearance, the pressure mounted. She had become a target in a game she had never agreed to play. The ball at Lady Hathaway's estate was the grandest event of the season, and despite her growing dread, Eugenie found herself standing at its heart, surrounded by the faces of her peers. The music played softly, the conversations hummed along as the glittering guests sipped champagne and danced with carefree abandon. But Eugenie's attention was elsewhere. Callum had arrived late, as usual, a dark figure amidst the sea of brightly colored gowns and tuxedos. His presence was unmistakable, magnetic, and as soon as his gaze met hers across the room, she felt the unmistakable pull of his attention. Her breath caught in her throat as his eyes lingered on her for a moment too long. She tried to look away, to focus on something else, anything else, but she couldn't. He was everywhere, even in the quietest spaces of her mind. Eugenie was still standing there, frozen, when her mother came up to her with an uneasy smile. "Lady Eugenie, you mustn't stand about looking so forlorn," her mother said. "Lord Ashford has arrived. He seems quite taken with you." Eugenie glanced toward the entrance, her stomach tightening as Lord Ashford, tall, handsome, and undeniably wealthy, approached her with a warm smile. He had been pursuing her steadily for weeks, but Eugenie had never felt the spark with him that she did with Callum, and though she tried to remind herself that Lord Ashford was a perfect match, her heart was elsewhere. She returned his smile with all the politeness she could muster, but as the dance began, her thoughts kept straying to Callum. She could feel his eyes on her even as she danced with Lord Ashford, an electric presence that made every movement feel heavier. After the dance, she excused herself to catch her breath and retreated to a quieter corner of the ballroom, seeking a moment of respite from the suffocating pressure. But Callum had other plans. As if summoned by her very thoughts, he appeared beside her, his voice low and purposeful. "You've avoided me long enough, Lady Eugenie," he said, his tone smooth and sure. "I think it's time we have a proper conversation." His words were not a request. He wasn't asking, he was commanding, and as always, she found herself powerless to resist the pull of his authority. Eugenie's heart raced. She knew what was coming, but she couldn't stop herself from listening. "Your suitors are vanishing, one by one," Callum continued, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've done nothing to force their hands, but you and I both know what's happening. I'm making sure no one else gets the chance to claim you. I'm taking you, Eugenie, whether you like it or not." His words hung in the air like a threat, cold and unyielding. She swallowed hard, fighting the surge of panic that rose in her chest. "You think you can control me," she managed, her voice trembling but defiant. "You think I'm just another prize to be won." "I don't want you as a prize," Callum replied, his voice softening for a moment. "I want you for myself. For my future." Eugenie's thoughts scrambled to make sense of what he was saying. He wasn't just a man trying to manipulate her into an engagement, he was trying to break her will. He wanted to bend her to his desires. She wanted to push him away, to stand firm and reject his claim on her life, but the part of her that still longed for the passionate connection they had shared in those stolen moments couldn't let go. "What are you asking me to do?" she whispered, barely able to hear herself over the pounding of her heart. Callum stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Marry me," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "I'll destroy every man who tries to take you from me, Eugenie. You will belong to me. Your life will be mine to control." The words were a dark promise, a binding declaration, and though every fiber of her being screamed to refuse, something deep inside her stirred. She knew that Callum wasn't offering her a choice. Not really. He was giving her an ultimatum: marry him, or watch as everything she had once held dear was taken from her. As the weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak, Eugenie could feel the walls around her life crumbling. This wasn't the future she had envisioned for herself. She had dreamed of a marriage based on love, respect, a partnership, but this? This was something darker, something she didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. "You think you can just ruin my life because you want me," she said, her voice breaking with a mix of fury and despair. "You're wrong. I will not be controlled." Callum's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening as he stepped back slightly. "Then you'll have no one," he said coldly. "You'll be left with nothing but the ruin of your choices." The words stung, but they weren't just a threat, they were the truth. Eugenie knew in that moment that if she rejected him, she would lose everything. Her family's reputation, her financial security, all of it would be gone. And yet, even as she struggled to reconcile her own desires with the pressure building inside her, one thought stood out among the rest: Callum wasn't just offering her a life with him. He was demanding submission, control, possession. There was no love in his words, only the cold certainty of ownership. "Marry me, Eugenie," he repeated, his voice softer but more insistent now. "Or I will ruin every prospect you have. I'll make sure no one ever looks at you the same way again." In that moment, Eugenie felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her own choices. She was no longer in control of her life, he had taken that from her. The question now wasn't whether she could say no to him, it was whether she could live with the consequences of saying yes. The morning after Callum's ultimatum, Eugenie woke with a heavy heart, the weight of his words pressing down on her like an iron chain. She had spent the night turning over the same thoughts, torn between the need to protect her family's future and the fear of losing herself entirely to a man who seemed to want nothing less than her complete submission. There was no escaping the truth, her choices had narrowed to a single, grim path. She had received no word from Lord Ashford, who had fled to the continent in disgrace, leaving her family with no hope of securing a match with a man of his wealth and status. With his departure, Eugenie's hopes had been dashed. Callum had made sure of that. Her life, once filled with possibilities, had become a series of calculations, each more desperate than the last. When the formal proposal came, delivered by Callum's solicitor, she knew she had no choice but to accept. The engagement was not born of any kind of romance, nor was it an act of love. It was a cold, pragmatic decision. Eugenie had spent so much of her life as a pawn in her father's financial schemes, and now, she was a pawn in Callum's game, forced to marry him to save her family from ruin. It was a hollow victory, one that left her feeling more trapped than ever. The news was met with immediate approval from her mother and the rest of her family. Her parents were thrilled, of course. Callum was, after all, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England. They saw the marriage as a great triumph, a lifeline thrown to them in the wake of their financial collapse. But to Eugenie, it felt like a death sentence. She had become a piece of property to be transferred from one man's control to another. She had no say, no power in this decision. She was to be wed to Callum, not out of any affection, but because she had no other option. The weeks that followed were a blur of arrangements and negotiations, and as the time for the wedding drew closer, Eugenie felt herself retreating further into herself. The house that had once been her home, where she had spent countless hours reading, learning, dreaming, now felt like a gilded cage. Her engagement to Callum had been formalized, but nothing had changed between them. They continued to share the same space, but there was no warmth between them. Callum's demeanor was as cold as ever, and Eugenie found herself walking on eggshells in his presence. He made no effort to get to know her better, to ease her fears, to even pretend that he cared for her. There were no gestures of affection, no words of comfort. Instead, there was silence, a growing distance between them that seemed to stretch with each passing day. She had told him, in no uncertain terms, that she would marry him, but never love him. It had been her only form of resistance, a feeble declaration of her autonomy, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were empty. She couldn't afford love, not in a marriage like this. She couldn't afford to feel anything but cold indifference. The day came when she moved into Callum's grand residence in London. His mother, Winifred, was a figure of towering elegance and ice-cold politeness. She greeted Eugenie with a smile that was more of a smirk, an acknowledgement of the inevitable fate that had brought them together. Winifred's subtle glances, her sharp assessments, made Eugenie feel as though she were being weighed, measured, and found lacking. It was clear that Callum's mother saw her not as a daughter-in-law, but as a necessary accessory, an extension of her son's power and status. They exchanged pleasantries, but there was nothing warm in their exchanges. Eugenie could already feel the walls of the house closing in around her, the sense that she was nothing more than a fixture in a house of cold expectations. The days passed in a monotonous rhythm, filled with empty dinners, even emptier conversations, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. She tried to focus on the small things that once gave her comfort, the books in the library, the quiet solitude of her rooms, but even these were tainted by the presence of Callum. His dominance hung over everything, a shadow that refused to lift. And then there were the nights. They shared separate bedrooms, of course. Callum had made it clear from the start that their marriage was not one built on affection. But still, Eugenie felt the weight of his presence every time she passed by his door, every time she saw him in the hall. He was always there, looming over her life, a constant reminder of the chains that bound her. One night, after a particularly tense dinner where Winifred had pointedly ignored her existence, Eugenie found herself standing by the window in her room, staring out at the London skyline. The city was alive with light and noise, a stark contrast to the quiet oppression she felt inside the walls of the house. She wanted to scream, to lash out at the injustice of it all, but instead, she stood in silence, her hands clenched at her sides. This was her life now, a life that had been stripped of agency, a life where love was a luxury she could no longer afford. The silence between her and Callum grew heavier with each passing day, and yet, there was a part of her that couldn't stop hoping. It was a foolish hope, she knew, but the truth was undeniable. Beneath the cold, calculating exterior, she had seen something in him, something that suggested there was more to him than the domineering man who had trapped her in this engagement. But hope, she quickly reminded herself, was a dangerous thing. There was no room for it in her life. Not anymore. So, she resigned herself to this new reality. She would marry him. She would keep her head down and survive. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live without losing herself entirely. But she would never love him. That, she swore to herself, would always remain true. The days bled into weeks, and the tension in the house only grew thicker as the engagement stretched on. Eugenie felt like a stranger in her own life, trapped between the reality of her situation and the ghost of what might have been. Callum, though always present, remained distant in a way that chilled her even further. He did not push her, nor did he try to bend her to his will in the overt way she had feared. Instead, he seemed to play a waiting game, studying her from a distance, while she felt like a specimen under examination. It was maddening, this game of silence, but it was the silence that made everything feel so suffocating. She had tried to keep her mind occupied with the things that once brought her joy, books, quiet walks, and the fleeting hope that someday things would change. But with every passing day, she could feel herself growing weaker, losing the resolve that had once seemed so clear. Callum, though silent in most ways, was a master of subtlety. He had begun to show up at breakfast every morning without fail, sitting across from her with that inscrutable look in his eyes. He would speak, but only in the most disarming ways, talking of everything from politics to philosophy, finding topics that caught her interest and holding her in a quiet, intellectual dance that felt both stimulating and dangerous. Each conversation seemed harmless, but over time, the routine wore away at her defenses. He remembered the smallest things, an obscure philosopher she had once mentioned, the poet whose work she had once read aloud, the book she had spent hours searching for in the library. He gave her books as gifts, each one carefully selected to appeal to her mind, and in those moments, Eugenie found herself torn between gratitude and irritation. She couldn't deny that she was drawn to him, his intellect, his deep understanding of the world, and the way he seemed to see through her like no one else had ever done. Each day, as they debated the merits of different thinkers or discussed the complexities of human nature, the space between them seemed to shrink. It was maddening, the way he disarmed her, the way he made her feel understood even when she didn't want to be. There was no affection in his actions, no overt attempt to woo her, yet the effect of his presence on her was undeniable. It was as though he was slowly unraveling the threads of her resistance, one quiet conversation at a time. Despite herself, she found herself looking forward to their talks, and with every moment they spent in that quiet, intellectual exchange, a part of her began to soften. It was as though he was using his intellect as a weapon, a subtle, almost insidious form of seduction. The dinners they shared were no longer filled with polite chatter. There was an undercurrent of tension, of unspoken words hanging between them like a dangerous secret. Every glance he threw her way, every word he said, seemed to carry more weight than before. And when the evening came, after dinner, it was the library that called to her. It became their space, unspoken but understood, a place where, after a long day, they would retreat, and the intellectual exchanges would shift into something more private. They would sit across from each other, the dim light casting shadows across their faces, their discussions moving from the abstract to something more personal. Their proximity made her heart race in ways that she couldn't quite explain. She found herself losing track of time, caught up in the way his voice would linger in the air, the way his gaze would sometimes stray to her lips as they spoke. There were moments when the tension between them felt like a spark, crackling just beneath the surface, and she would have to force herself to focus on their conversation to avoid acknowledging the way her body reacted to him. It was a strange and unsettling thing, this attraction that was both unwelcome and undeniable. She had sworn to herself that she would never love him, that she would never give him that power, but with each passing day, it became harder to maintain that promise. He was not like the men who had courted her in the past, not like the suitors who had been content to flatter her with compliments or dance around her with polite niceties. Callum was different. He was not interested in sweet words or grand gestures. He was interested in her mind, in what made her tick, in the things that stirred her passions and challenges her intellect. And there, in that intellectual space, he was winning. But the physical attraction that built between them could not be ignored. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel as though she were the only woman in the world, and the times when their hands brushed, or their gazes locked too long, were becoming harder to ignore. The near kisses came in stolen moments, when he would lean in close to correct her on a point or brush a stray lock of hair from her face, his breath warm against her skin. Every time it happened, Eugenie felt herself falter, the anger and resistance she had built up slowly weakening in the face of his overwhelming presence. "When you kiss me," he said one evening, his voice low, almost teasing, it will be because you want to, not because you feel obligated." The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a brief moment, she was speechless. Her heart pounded, her breath caught in her throat, and though she wanted to protest, to push him away, she couldn't. His words, like everything he said, carried an undeniable weight. She wanted to deny it, to say she didn't care, that she didn't feel anything, but deep down, she knew it was a lie. "I don't need your games, Callum," she snapped, trying to pull away from the tension that threatened to consume her. "I'm not playing a game, Eugenie," he replied, his voice steady, unwavering. "But you will. You will kiss me when you're ready, when you finally stop pretending that this doesn't affect you." The quiet challenge in his voice only made her pulse quicken, and though she wanted to reject him, a part of her, one she barely understood, was already falling. "Never is a long time, darling," he added, his voice softening just slightly as he leaned in, his gaze never leaving hers. Eugenie couldn't answer, couldn't speak for the fear that gripped her heart, the fear that she was already losing herself in this complicated, dangerous web that Callum had so carefully spun. It was late one night when Eugenie's world shifted ever so slightly. She had been unable to sleep, her thoughts a tangle of unresolved feelings and mounting frustration. Callum's presence in her life had begun to feel inescapable, his influence more pervasive than ever. But despite the growing emotional storm, she had kept herself detached, burying the vulnerable parts of herself in a layer of cold logic. Or so she thought. That night, she wandered the halls of Callum's London residence, seeking respite from her thoughts, when she found herself standing in front of the door to his study. It was unusually late, and she hadn't expected to find anyone awake at this hour. But the door, slightly ajar, revealed a flickering light inside. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. What she saw surprised her. Callum was hunched over a desk, his face drawn with concentration as he scribbled something onto a piece of paper. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his sleeves rolled up, and his brow furrowed in a way that made him seem less like the cold, calculating Duke she had come to know and more like a man driven by a cause. He was alone, and the atmosphere in the room was far different from their usual encounters. There was no pretense here, no games, just a man immersed in something that clearly mattered to him. Eugenie hesitated, unsure whether she should retreat and leave him undisturbed, but something inside her urged her to stay. She stepped forward just enough to catch the words on the paper. It was a proposal for factory reform, a detailed plan for workers' rights and improved conditions. The words were sharp, well-reasoned, and passionate, revealing a side of Callum she hadn't expected. The man who had appeared so arrogant and possessive now seemed vulnerable. His dedication to this cause, his desire to make a difference, was as far removed from the man who had once threatened to ruin her prospects as one could get. She stood there in silence, trying to absorb the full weight of what she had just discovered. She had always seen Callum as a figure of power, a man who controlled everything around him with ease, including her. But this side of him, this quiet intensity, had been hidden behind the walls he had so carefully constructed. She realized then that she didn't know him at all. Before she could retreat back into the shadows, Callum's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You've been standing there for quite some time, Lady Eugenie." She froze, caught. There was no point in pretending she hadn't been watching him. With a sigh, she stepped fully into the room, meeting his gaze. His eyes were dark, still holding that impenetrable edge, but there was something different now, something raw beneath the surface. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said, her voice soft, unsure of what to say next. He gestured to the chair across from him, his usual commanding tone replaced with something more neutral, even inviting. "Sit with me, Eugenie," he said, his words careful but unyielding. She hesitated before taking the seat he had offered, still processing the surprising vulnerability she had just witnessed. "I didn't expect this from you," she admitted, her voice low as she glanced at the papers on his desk. He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You think I'm incapable of caring for anything but myself?" he asked, his tone gentle but with an underlying edge that she couldn't quite place. Eugenie had no answer. She had always assumed that Callum's focus had been solely on power, on controlling her, on bending everyone to his will. But what if there was more to him than that? What if the man she had thought she knew so well was hiding a depth she hadn't been able to see? "I've been focused on other things," he said after a moment, leaning back in his chair. "But it's hard to ignore what's wrong when you're confronted with it every day." Eugenie's mind raced. He was talking about factory conditions, about the suffering of workers, about something outside of his usual world of wealth and privilege. It was a side of him she hadn't imagined existed, and yet here it was, laid bare before her. "I didn't know," she whispered, the words feeling strange on her tongue. She had spent so long viewing Callum as an obstacle, a man whose motives were clear only in his desire to control her. But now, she was seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just a man driven by power, he was someone who, at least in his own way, cared about others, who was trying to make a difference in a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. Callum's eyes softened slightly as he met her gaze, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Eugenie," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'm not asking you to excuse everything I've done. But I am asking for a chance to do something good, something meaningful. Not for me, but for them." She nodded slowly, her heart swelling with a mixture of admiration and guilt. She had never expected this from him, never thought she would see Callum as anything other than a man who sought to dominate. And yet, here he was, revealing a side of himself that made her question everything she had thought she knew. "I didn't realize," she admitted. "You've spent so much time hiding behind the persona of the powerful Duke that I never thought to look beyond it." Callum was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he stared at the papers on the desk. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, tinged with an honesty she had never expected. "Power without purpose is tyranny," he said quietly. "I've been trying to make something more of myself. Trying to fix the things I've broken." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Eugenie felt the walls between them crack, just a little. There was no declaration of love, no sudden shift in their relationship, but the cracks in the armor had appeared. For the first time since their engagement, Eugenie felt the walls around her heart begin to soften. Maybe Callum wasn't the villain she had painted him to be. Maybe there was more to him, more to them, than she had ever allowed herself to believe. And though she wasn't ready to forgive him, to let go of the anger that had kept her guarded for so long, she couldn't help but wonder if there was a way forward for both of them. The night of Lady Cromwell's ball arrived with a pomp and grandeur that made Eugenie feel the weight of her engagement to Callum more than ever. The ballroom was a dizzying swirl of laughter, silk gowns, and glittering jewels, but beneath the surface, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Eugenie had become a subject of quiet speculation, whispered gossip that she could almost feel pressing against her skin. She had heard the rumors, the hushed comments that followed her wherever she went. There was no denying it now, her engagement to Callum, a man whose every move seemed calculated and cold, had become the talk of the town. She felt the eyes of the world on her tonight, as if every glance was a weight she had to carry. Lord Ashford's sudden departure from the country had left a void that no one else could fill. But then there was Callum, the Duke of Callum, who had somehow become the most talked-about man in all of London. Even her mother, normally so focused on propriety, couldn't hide the pride in her eyes when she looked at Eugenie, her daughter, now bound to one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Yet, for all the outward celebrations, the weight of the engagement between Eugenie and Callum felt suffocating. She had no illusions about their relationship. There was no warmth between them, no genuine affection. Their marriage, when it came, would be a cold union built on duty and convenience rather than love. The night dragged on, a series of mindless dances and polite conversations that left Eugenie feeling more and more like an object, an accessory in Callum's life rather than a partner. She tried to maintain her composure, but it was becoming more and more difficult to ignore the undercurrent of unease that flowed through her whenever Callum's piercing gaze fell upon her from across the room. There were moments when their eyes met, fleeting seconds that seemed to stretch for eternity, and in those moments, Eugenie couldn't shake the sense that Callum was watching her closely, studying her every move. It was unnerving, and yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about it. She had always believed that she could never love him, that their relationship was nothing more than a transaction. But as the evening wore on, she couldn't help but feel the pull of something deeper, something that both terrified and exhilarated her. Callum moved through the crowd with ease, his presence commanding and unwavering, but there was something different about the way he moved tonight. There was a tension in the air, a barely contained rage that lurked beneath his composed exterior. Eugenie didn't know what to make of it, but she knew something was brewing, something that would shatter the fragile peace that had existed between them. She was drawn from her thoughts by the sound of laughter, and when she turned, she found a young lord, a charming and somewhat foolish flirt, dancing with her cousin. He gave her a wink as he passed by, and Eugenie couldn't help but feel the stirrings of annoyance rise within her. It wasn't the flirtation itself that bothered her, it was the fact that the young man seemed to do so with such ease, while she felt nothing but the weight of her engagement to Callum, a reminder that she was trapped in a gilded cage. The young lord's flirtation was nothing more than a harmless exchange, but when Callum's eyes met hers from across the room, she saw the shift in his expression, a flicker of something dark and possessive that made her stomach twist. He was watching her intently, his gaze locked on the young lord, and for the first time, Eugenie saw something in him that frightened her. Callum's movements were subtle, but his body language was unmistakable. The air around him seemed to grow colder, his jaw tightening, his posture rigid as he observed the interaction between her and the young lord. The distance between them felt unbearable as she tried to keep her composure. But the next moment, Callum was at her side, his presence looming over her, and her heart skipped a beat. "I believe you are in danger of being too easily distracted, Lady Eugenie," he murmured, his voice low and tinged with an edge of warning. She stiffened, her pulse quickening as she felt the weight of his words. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that his gaze had lingered far too long on her, watching her every move, every expression. She didn't respond at first, unsure of how to answer. She had grown so accustomed to his quiet dominance that the intensity of this moment, the possessiveness in his tone, sent a shiver down her spine. Callum's eyes never left her, his grip on her arm firm as he led her to the center of the ballroom. The music swirled around them, a waltz that should have been light-hearted, but in that moment, it felt like a battle, an unspoken tension that crackled between them. She could feel the eyes of the room on them as they danced, the whispers of the guests, but none of it mattered. Callum's attention was all-consuming, and the world outside seemed to fade away. His eyes locked onto hers, fierce and determined. He was a man who rarely showed his emotions, but tonight, Eugenie could see them all in the storm raging behind his gaze. His lips curled into a thin, controlled smile. "Tell me, Eugenie," he said, his voice soft but full of underlying tension, "do you enjoy playing with fire?" The question hit her like a jolt of electricity, but she couldn't answer. Her mind raced, her body responding to the heat of his presence, to the unspoken challenge in his words. She didn't want to be this person, the one who was drawn to him, to the darkness he carried so effortlessly. But in that moment, as they danced closer, she couldn't deny the magnetic pull between them. It was dangerous, it was terrifying, but it was real. The waltz ended abruptly, and as the music reached its crescendo, Callum's lips found hers in a kiss that was nothing like the delicate, hesitant exchanges of earlier days. It was urgent, intense, full of anger and desire, a collision of everything they had both tried to hide from. Eugenie's heart raced as she responded, her body caught between resistance and something far deeper, far more powerful. The kiss was a spark that ignited something inside her, something she couldn't extinguish, no matter how hard she tried. As they pulled away, breathless and shaken, Callum's voice was low and rough against her ear. "You hate that you want me," he whispered, his words a promise, a threat, and a challenge all at once. Eugenie's chest heaved as she pulled away slightly, meeting his gaze. "That changes nothing," she replied, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and longing. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew something had shifted between them. There was no going back now. The days after the kiss at Lady Cromwell's ball felt like a quiet storm, the calm before the inevitable chaos that loomed ahead. Eugenie had barely slept since that night, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions that she couldn't make sense of. The kiss had shattered the fragile wall she had carefully built around herself, and now, every time she was in Callum's presence, it was as though that moment hung between them like an unspoken promise. But it wasn't just the kiss that unsettled her, it was everything that had happened since. Callum had become more unpredictable, his behavior more erratic. He watched her more closely, his dark gaze always lingering a moment too long, as though he were trying to pierce through the layers of her carefully controlled exterior. It was maddening, and yet, there was no denying that part of her had started to crave his attention, even as much as she hated herself for it. The tension between them had become unbearable, and with every passing day, Eugenie felt herself losing more of the control she had fought so hard to maintain. But it wasn't just the emotional battle that was wearing her down, it was the mounting realization that Callum was manipulating her life in ways she couldn't ignore. She had begun to notice strange things, things she couldn't explain. Suitors continued to mysteriously withdraw their proposals, all citing vague and nebulous reasons, but it didn't take long for Eugenie to realize that Callum's influence extended far beyond their own interactions. She had heard whispers, seen the way other men had suddenly seemed to avoid her, their eyes averted whenever she passed them in the halls of society. And it wasn't just men who were avoiding her, even some of her female friends had become distant, their smiles forced, their conversations shallow. It was as though she were becoming a pariah, and she knew that Callum was behind it. The realization came in a slow, creeping wave, like a cold hand tightening around her throat. He was isolating her. He was making sure that no one else could have her, no one else could even dare to look at her the way they once had. He was taking control of every aspect of her life, and what terrified her most was that she hadn't realized how much she had already been manipulated. But it wasn't just the social isolation that stung, it was the emotional manipulation, the games Callum was playing with her heart. It was the constant push and pull, the moments of tenderness that felt so real, only to be followed by coldness, by silence. She had tried to confront him about it, tried to make him understand that his actions were breaking her, but each time, his response was the same, quiet dismissal, a cold smile, and a promise of more to come. Eugenie had begun to feel as though she were living in a nightmare, a world where nothing made sense, where she was trapped in a game of power that she hadn't signed up for. But the breaking point came when, one evening, she discovered a series of letters hidden in Callum's study. She had gone looking for something to occupy her mind, hoping to distract herself from the mounting sense of despair that had begun to consume her, when she stumbled upon them. At first, she had thought they were just routine correspondence, perhaps business matters or letters to other noblemen. But as she scanned through them, her heart sank. The letters were written by Callum himself, and they contained detailed instructions, subtle yet unmistakable, about how to manipulate her social prospects, how to keep other suitors at bay, and how to make sure that no one else could ever take her from him. It was a revelation that shattered everything she had believed about their engagement. This wasn't a marriage born of affection or even mutual respect, it was a calculated move on his part, a game in which she was nothing more than a pawn. She could feel the rage building inside her, the anger and frustration she had held in check for so long finally bubbling to the surface. How could he do this? How could he treat her like this? The betrayal was a weight she could no longer bear. She stormed into his study, the letters clenched in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. "Callum," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "What is this? What kind of game are you playing?" He looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable, as though he had expected this confrontation. "Eugenie," he said calmly, his voice steady, "I see you found my letters." She threw them onto the desk in front of him, her chest heaving with anger. "How long, Callum?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "How long have you been manipulating me? How long have you been destroying my life without my consent?" For a moment, Callum didn't speak, his gaze fixed on her with that familiar intensity. And then, with a sigh, he stood up and walked toward her. "I never wanted to hurt you, Eugenie," he said, his voice low and almost regretful. "But I couldn't allow anyone else to have you. I couldn't let you slip away from me, not when I knew what you meant to me." She recoiled, her heart twisting in a mixture of disbelief and pain. "What I mean to you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't about what I mean to you. This is about your need for control. This is about your obsession with owning me." Callum's face hardened, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and almost threatening. "You think I'm doing this out of selfishness, out of cruelty, but you're wrong. I'm doing this because I need you, Eugenie. I can't live without you. You're mine, and I'll do whatever it takes to make you see that." His words hit her like a physical blow, and Eugenie felt her knees weaken beneath her. She had heard enough. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "No more. I can't be a part of this, Callum. I can't be your possession any longer." The words hung in the air, thick with finality, and for the first time, Eugenie felt a sense of clarity, of resolve. She had been caught in Callum's web for so long, but now, she was done. The game was over? She turned and walked out of his study, leaving him behind, but not without a final glance back. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she was done being controlled. Weeks passed after Eugenie's confrontation with Callum, and the silence between them was deafening. She had demanded a separate residence, insisting on the space to think, to find herself again after everything that had happened. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point, and it became impossible for her to stay under the same roof, suffocated by the oppressive presence of a man who had both consumed her life and shattered her sense of self. Callum had agreed to her request, though she knew it wasn't without cost. There was no love between them, not anymore, only a cold, distant acknowledgement of the contract that bound them. Her new residence, though still lavish, lacked the warmth and comfort she had once believed would come with a union like hers. It felt like a prison, one of her own making, but she couldn't escape the gnawing truth that she had been complicit in the circumstances that had led her here. The days alone in her new home were filled with the emptiness she had feared, and it seemed like every hour dragged on in agonizing slowness. She tried to distract herself with the things she used to enjoy: books, walks, even attempts at writing, but it was never enough. Her thoughts always returned to Callum. Even though they were separated physically, he was never far from her mind. And then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. It was not from anyone she had expected, but from Callum himself. The envelope was thick, heavy with the weight of the words contained within, and as she opened it, a strange mix of dread and curiosity gripped her. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the neat, precise handwriting. "Eugenie, I know that you hate me. You have every right to. I have treated you cruelly, manipulating your life in ways I cannot undo. But I am writing to you now because I owe you the truth. I owe you the pieces of myself that I never showed you. I need you to understand why I did what I did, even though it's no excuse. I will not beg for your forgiveness, but I am asking for a chance to explain. Please, allow me that much. I know it's too late for us, but I cannot let you go without telling you the truth. I am sorry, Eugenie. I am truly sorry. The letter was the first genuine thing Callum had ever written to her. It was raw, vulnerable, and it tore at her in ways she hadn't expected. She could feel the weight of his words pressing against her chest, a force she couldn't ignore, even if she wanted to. She set the letter down slowly, her hands trembling as she tried to absorb what he was saying. Was this the man she had been married to all along? The one who had so ruthlessly manipulated her, who had taken everything from her and left her with nothing? Or was this the man she had glimpsed in his study, the one who cared about something beyond power, who had a cause, a purpose? She couldn't be sure, but what she knew was that Callum had left an imprint on her, one that couldn't be erased. She spent the next few days in a daze, the letter haunting her as she read it over and over, trying to reconcile the Callum she knew with the one who had written those words. She didn't know what to feel. Anger, yes, but also something else, a strange, aching sorrow that she didn't know how to name. She wanted to hate him, to push him away and never look back, but the part of her that had once loved him couldn't quite let go. The letter had opened something in her, a door she had kept shut for far too long. And then, as if in answer to the question swirling in her mind, more letters arrived. Each day, another letter, filled with honesty and emotion that Callum had never shown before. The letters were not long, but they were filled with details she had never known: his childhood, the loneliness he had suffered after his father's neglect, the struggles he had faced as he tried to live up to impossible expectations. He spoke of his regrets, his fear of losing control, his inability to understand how to love her without suffocating her. Each letter felt like a small revelation, a piece of a puzzle that had always been incomplete. Callum had never been the man she had thought him to be. His actions, his possessiveness, had been born from fear of abandonment, fear of never being enough, and a deep, aching need to control everything in his life, including her. Eugenie read the letters late into the night, her emotions a tangled mess of compassion and hurt. She knew she couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the damage that had been done, but she also knew that she couldn't ignore the changes in Callum. For the first time, she saw him not as a villain, but as a man who had been lost, who had made mistakes, and who, perhaps, had the capacity for change. The letters weren't just an apology, they were a confession. A raw, painful admission that Callum had failed her, but that he was trying to make amends, even if it was too late. Eugenie didn't know if she could forgive him. Forgiveness seemed like an impossible thing, something she wasn't ready for, not yet. But she couldn't pretend that these letters hadn't affected her. They had shaken her to her core, and for the first time in months, she found herself questioning everything she had believed about Callum and about herself. She hadn't realized how much of her identity had been tied to the idea of escape, of breaking free from the life her family had trapped her in. She had spent so long trying to resist Callum, trying to keep him at arm's length, that she had forgotten how much she had once craved the connection they had shared. The letters stopped coming after a week, but the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of before. It was a space between them, a place where things could change, where healing might be possible. Callum had offered her an apology, and though it wasn't enough to fix everything, it had begun to open a door that had once been firmly locked. Eugenie found herself standing at a crossroads, uncertain of which path to take. She could continue down the road of anger and separation, keeping herself isolated from him, or she could allow herself the painful possibility of reconciliation. For the first time in a long while, she didn't know what to do. All she knew was that she couldn't go back to who she had been. The future was unwritten, and she had to decide whether to face it alone or to face it with Callum. It was days before Eugenie could bring herself to respond to Callum's letters, to allow the raw emotions he had poured onto the page to settle into some kind of understanding. She had spent those days in a haze, torn between the part of her that still wanted to hate him for what he had done, and the other part, the part that had begun to see him as something more than the possessive man she had once feared. The idea of reconciliation, of moving forward with him, felt like an impossible task, yet a small, undeniable part of her began to wonder if it could be done, if they could move beyond the manipulation and control, and somehow build something real. The turning point came when Callum, as if sensing the deep struggle within her, proposed a painful but necessary course of action. He suggested that in order for her to move forward, she must make amends with the men whose lives he had ruined. Ashford, Pemberton, and others whose names had been whispered in the dark corners of the ton, all had their lives irrevocably altered by Callum's interference. The damage had been done, but now, if there was any hope for healing, it would lie in repairing what had been broken. At first, Eugenie recoiled at the thought. How could she face them, knowing how much they had been hurt by her engagement to Callum, by her unwilling complicity in it all? She had spent so much of her life trying to live up to her family's expectations, to navigate the suffocating rules of society, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly be accountable for her own actions. But Callum's insistence on the matter, his willingness to face his own wrongs, began to chip away at her resistance. So, reluctantly, she agreed to meet with the men who had once been her suitors, to hear their pain, their anger, their frustrations. The first was Lord Ashford, whose departure had torn apart not just her future but the plans of so many others in her family. She had been prepared for his anger, but when she sat across from him in the quiet, austere drawing room, it was his sorrow that pierced her heart. His eyes, once filled with hope and excitement for a future with her, were now clouded with bitterness. "I thought you were different, Eugenie," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were someone who understood what it meant to choose love, to build something real. But instead, you let him destroy everything." His words hit her like a physical blow, but they were necessary. She needed to hear them, to understand the depth of what had happened, not just to her, but to the people whose lives had been forever altered by Callum's machinations. She apologized, genuinely, for the way things had turned out, for the role she had unknowingly played in his downfall. The meeting was painful, but it was also cathartic, a necessary step on the road to healing. Next came Lord Pemberton, who had been more than just a suitor. He had once been a friend, someone Eugenie had admired, and the way his proposal had been so easily dismantled left a bitter taste in her mouth. When she saw him again, the hurt was still visible in his eyes, though it was now tempered with resignation. "I never thought it would end like this," he said, shaking his head as they sat down in the small parlor. "I never thought I would be so easily discarded." There was a moment of silence between them as Eugenie struggled to find the right words. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "I never meant for you to be caught in the middle. I was trapped, just as you were, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for everything that happened." Lord Pemberton looked at her, his gaze softening, but there was still a hint of distance, a painful acknowledgement that what had been lost between them could never be fully repaired. He nodded, accepting her apology, but it was clear that the hurt remained. With each meeting, Eugenie began to understand the true weight of the mess she and Callum had created. It wasn't just her future that had been affected, but the futures of those around her. She couldn't undo the damage, but she could try to make amends, to face the consequences of her actions and attempt to rebuild what had been broken. Callum had watched her throughout the entire process, standing by her side without interfering, allowing her to take the lead in seeking redemption. His patience, though silent, spoke volumes. He knew that he could not undo his past mistakes, but he had begun to see that, perhaps, there was a way forward. It was after the final meeting, a painful reconciliation with one of the men whose life had been most directly impacted, that something changed between them. Eugenie was exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually, but there was a quiet pride in the way she had handled the aftermath. She had faced the men who had been hurt, had taken responsibility for her part in the destruction of their futures, and in doing so, had started to heal her own wounds. But there was more to be done. It was that night, after the final meeting, that Callum came to her with a quiet proposal of his own. "I've done things I can't undo, Eugenie," he said, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I've hurt you, I've hurt others, and I can't take that back. But I want to change. I want to make things right, for you, for us, for the future. If you can find it in yourself to forgive me, to trust me again, I will spend every day trying to prove that I'm not the man I was." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had been through, everything he had learned. Eugenie didn't know if she could ever fully forgive him, not right away, at least. But she also knew that the path to healing, to true reconciliation, could only begin if they both chose to walk it together. "I don't know if I can ever truly trust you again," she admitted softly, her heart aching with the rawness of her honesty. "But I'm willing to try. For both of us." And in that moment, something shifted between them, a mutual understanding that while they could never undo the past, they had the power to shape the future. It was not going to be easy, and it would take time, but Eugenie knew that the first step had been taken. And that was all she could ask for. The wedding day arrived with a quiet grandeur, a day that had seemed impossible not so long ago, but now felt like the natural next step in a journey filled with pain, growth, and surprising tenderness. Eugenie stood before the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with a calmness that she hadn't known was possible. The woman who had once been filled with anger and fear, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, was now someone else. She had faced the wreckage of her past, had made amends where she could, and had allowed herself the chance to see Callum in a different light, one that was not just about control, manipulation, or possession, but about the possibility of change, of redemption. As the final touches were applied to her gown, the elegant silk tracing the curves of her figure, Eugenie could feel the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, but it wasn't the oppressive weight of old expectations, it was the weight of the future, a future that was no longer dictated by the past. Her heart, though still cautious, was no longer full of the despair that had once clouded her every thought. As the doors opened and she made her way down the aisle, her gaze found Callum's, and for the first time in a long while, she saw him clearly, really saw him. He was standing there, not as the man who had once terrified her, but as someone who had struggled, fought, and finally understood the value of love and trust. His gaze was steady, filled with a quiet but undeniable longing. He had changed. And so had she. When their eyes met, the world seemed to fall away. There was no longer room for doubt, no room for the lingering shadows of past manipulation. What remained was something real, something forged through honesty, vulnerability, and, above all, choice. As she reached him, their hands met, and in that moment, it felt as if they were both stepping into a new life, together. The ceremony itself was short, simple, but every word felt profound. The vows they exchanged weren't just promises of love, but promises of trust, of partnership, of building something neither of them had ever thought possible. Eugenie's voice faltered slightly as she spoke her vows, but the strength behind her words was undeniable. She had learned to choose Callum, not because she was forced to, not because she had no other options, but because she wanted to. And Callum, too, spoke with a raw honesty that made her heart swell. "I will never ask for your forgiveness again," he had said, his voice low, "but I promise to be worthy of it, to be worthy of you. I will never take you for granted. I will spend every day of my life trying to be the man you deserve." It was in that moment, standing before their friends, their family, and each other, that Eugenie realized just how far they had come. Their marriage was not born out of a desire for control or duty, it was born out of a shared commitment to make things work, to rebuild from the wreckage they had both caused. And though they were still uncertain of what the future held, one thing was clear: they were in it together. The reception that followed was a blur of faces, well-wishes, and laughter, but Eugenie's mind kept returning to Callum, to the quiet way he watched her across the room, his gaze full of something she had once thought was impossible between them, genuine affection. As they danced their first waltz as husband and wife, the world seemed to fall away. It was just the two of them, moving in rhythm, finally at peace with one another. The touch of his hand on her back, the warmth of his presence, were no longer sources of tension or fear, but of comfort. The months of separation, of struggle, of finding themselves amidst the chaos, had led them here, to this moment, to this new beginning. The rest of the evening was filled with small moments of joy, the laughter of their friends, the quiet comfort of knowing that they had fought for this, that they had chosen each other. The world outside may have continued on its chaotic, uncertain path, but inside this moment, inside this room, they were finally free. Later that night, in the privacy of their chambers, their conversation turned from the formalities of the day to something more personal, more intimate. The walls that had once separated them, walls built on distrust, fear, and manipulation, had crumbled, and in their place stood a bond forged through patience, understanding, and the willingness to change. As they lay together in the quiet of the night, Eugenie felt the weight of their shared journey, of everything they had been through, and of everything they still had to learn. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a partnership. The years that followed were filled with challenges, of course, as all marriages are. There were moments of doubt, moments where they had to remind each other of the commitment they had made. But through it all, there was a quiet understanding between them. They had learned to trust, to choose, and to love in ways that were not just transactional, but deeply personal. 5 years later, Eugenie stood in the nursery of their home, watching as their young son, Thomas, played with his toys on the floor, while their daughter, Catherine, slept peacefully in her crib. The chaos of the world outside felt distant, and in that small, quiet room, Eugenie felt at peace. Her life had been irrevocably changed by the choices she had made, and by the man she had chosen to marry. Callum stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the life they had built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Their story had begun with obsession, with manipulation, but it had been built over time, with struggle, with growth, and with the choice to love each other every day. And as they stood there, watching their children, Eugenie knew that this was where she was meant to be. The road had been long, and at times, it had seemed impossible, but they had arrived at a place where love, in its truest form, had been chosen, not out of obligation, but out of mutual respect and understanding. And that, Eugenie realized, made all the difference.